Welcome to the Binary Agora. I am your host, Alba Rivera Martinez, and following on the trilogy of episodes that we have issued for the moment being here on the channel relating to how AI overviews is changing the whole search experience, stemming, for instance, with our episode with Gozia Kozak, then following with our discussion on opt-in and opt-out remedies with Todd Davis, and then with Tim Cohen's outlines of the news publishers' views. I believe that it was a ripe time to call the incumbent itself to the table to hear its views on the transformations operated on search via the regulatory obligations that have come into fruition with the DMA. To do that, I am joined today by Oliver Bethell. The DMA enthusiasts amongst us will know him from his many appearances at the European Commission's compliance workshops. He's also the global head of competition, regulatory engagement, and advisory at Google. So welcome to the Agora, Oliver.
Thank you very much for having me. And welcome to all the DMA enthusiasts.
There is no denying that the introduction of AI overviews has made many digital players turn their heads and rethink how they drive their online engagement moving forward. So users, as you well know, are now moving towards a zero-click behavior, and also the way in which they type their queries is different to the extent that now users ask more questions than they used to, so triggering a more passive stance towards search. So I wanted to ask you first, what do you believe is the future of search moving forward as a consequence of a Google AI-powered transformation by AI overviews and also other tools?
No, happy to. Thank you very much for the question. I suppose I may disagree somewhat with the notion that we're heading towards a zero-click outcome, but I can certainly give you a bit of a sense of how we see search developing at Google. And perhaps it's helpful to start at a sort of higher level and think about the nature of what search is. And at its core, it's information retrieval. And information retrieval has been developing for many years before AI overviews and will continue to develop for many years thereafter. There are a couple of things that you notice in the evolution of the ways in which people are searching, their expectations of a search engine or any information retrieval service for that matter. First, you see a trend towards wanting less friction in your searches. So for some time now, if I have been beginning a search query, DMA, binary, ag, a search engine should be able to anticipate what comes next. And that's about the deployment of machine learning. That's about the reduction in friction. And that's a feature, I think, of how evolving search queries have changed over time. Another aspect in which search has been changing is that people are asking more and more complicated questions of search engines. There's an expectation now as a consumer that you ought to be able to say to a search engine, my teenager is having a nosebleed, it's been lasting for 2 hours, very close to my heart, this particular query, it's been lasting for 2 hours, I've tried what I can to resolve it, what should I do? He also has a headache. And those kinds of complicated multi-part questions, we all have an expectation now that a search engine ought to be able to answer those sorts of things. And finally, I think that as search queries have evolved, we have more of an expectation for diversity in the search results. And again, I sort of think of what you do at Binary Agora. The question, I would like to know more about the Digital Markets Act and commentary on the application of the provisions to artificial intelligence might suggest that you want to go very quickly to a site like Binary Agora. You may not want to start with a big broadsheet newspaper for that kind of query. And those three trends, I think, are quite notable and are things that we're seeing very much as we think about responding to consumers' demand. And that, I think, explains how the technology is evolving. Things like AI overviews, but also the way in which conversational search is evolving more generally on other search engines, chatbots. It's all designed to respond to those kinds of evolving demands from consumers. As a consequence of those evolving demands and changes to their technology, of course, there's disruption in the ecosystem. And some of that is competition on the merits, of course. Where the traffic goes, what's the quality of the traffic? For every person who goes up in a search result, someone else goes down. So you will see changes as these new technologies are deployed to respond to users' evolving demands. And I think that's quite a natural consequence of competition on the merits. And what we're seeing when it comes to AI overviews is that we are having more queries, the queries are more complicated, and we are surfacing more results of wider diversity of websites. So those are some of the features of the behaviors that we're seeing when people are engaging with these kinds of new tools. And more generally, when you're, I suppose, looking at the merits of those kinds of changes over time, this is a comment I think one of your previous guests made, and the fairness of it, the equity of it, you have to have a sense of what your vision is for where search ought to be. How should search engines be responding to consumer demands? How should they be evolving? I think that it would be a sad place for European search results to stop at blue links and to not evolve to respond to consumer demands. I think our vision at Google is that it's a better world to be deploying these services rather than holding them back. I don't think it was a great outcome in France that we held our AI overviews back for a period of time. I feel like that was depriving people of the opportunity to experiment with some of these services, and I'm glad we were able to unblock that. But I do think you need to have a vision for how you think search should be evolving. I may have a different opinion to others, but for me at least, it's about responding to those evolving consumer demands. It's about doing that in a prudent and careful way, and we can talk a little bit about what that might mean. But it's not about holding search results in a 2008, 2004 state. It's about evolving, deploying the services, but doing it in a prudent and fair way.
Yeah. So I'm going to get really picky here because many people have said this, and it's not binary Agora, which is similar to Angora. That is not the idea here. It's supposed to be binary Agora, as in the Greek kind of meeting. So that's just
That's my terrible pronunciation.
Don't worry. It's, I think, a branding problem that we have. So in any case, I'm betting on what you were saying. So the introduction of AI overviews in particular has fallen within the European Commission's, the member states' purview on many different fronts. Here on the channel, we have observed some of them. So for instance, the first of these paths that the member states and the European Commission have chosen is that pertains to what we already explored relating to how the DMS directive might overlap with a potential entitlement to remunerate web publishers. And the second perspective relates to, as you well know, abuse of dominance. The European Commission has also triggered a 102 case sanctioning proceeding relating to this potential remuneration that web publishers would be owed for their content being displayed on the AI-generated summary. So how do you perceive, from your point of view, this enforcement strategy from the European Commission to try to stretch the exploitative abuse theory of harm that really tries to equate access with compensation? Do you believe that this type of remuneration is feasible within the business model that you already have?
So look, I think if you're with me as far as wanting these kinds of innovations to be launched in Europe, you can still ask that that's done in a fair and, as I say, prudent way. And I think that's what you see with Commissions 102, ongoing proceeding. I think you also see the Competition and Markets Authority looking carefully at these issues, also to determine the fairness of the arrangement that a search engine enters into with people who are creating content. And from my perspective at least, I think there are probably two big questions that inform that debate. And the second has two subparts. First of all, how much control are you giving to people on the internet as to how their content can be used? That's one important question. And then secondly, the value exchange, right? And I think there are probably two components to that. First of all, how are you attributing their content? How are you linking out to them, ensuring that traffic still drives to their sites? That's one component. And the second of two is, of course, what remuneration is being put in place, where you're using their content and you ought to be paying. How is that working? What is the nature of that deal? What opportunities do content creators have to enter into arrangements with a search engine? The Competition and Markets Authority actually moved very quickly on this, so perhaps I'll start there. And there you have a regulator looking principally at the question of controls and attribution. What controls can you give to the website, and what links are you going to provide out to their content? And one of the things that I'm very pleased that we were able to do quickly, because that's always the goal of my engagement with regulators, is to move quickly to a set of solutions and try and launch something that addresses the concerns. And that was something we were able to do in the UK. And what we did there was to launch a new control that allows people to decide whether or not they want to appear in these new features. That complements an existing control over whether or not you want to be used in training. And at the same time, the CMA has asked us questions about attribution and making sure that when people want to move from the summary answer to the deeper dive, I've got a sense from my AI overview that this is what the Agora website does. Did I pronounce it right then? No, maybe not. I'll keep trying. Agora. And I've got a sense of what binary Agora does as a website from a summary.
Yeah.
And I checked the overview for this just before our meeting. I'm able to jump off to the particular parts, the deeper dive. I want to learn more about the Munich case. I want to learn more about interoperability. I want to learn more about the application to AI. So how are we doing that in a fair way? Those are two questions where the CMA has focused its attention. And you can start there because with greater control, with a reassurance that the attribution is being done in a fair way, that of course gives you a good platform for having fair commercial discussions with the search engine also. And I think we're making good progress in that area also. We have an AI licensing pilot that's live. We've struck deals with around 200 publications. We also have, as a complement to that, what we call our extended news program, a previews program, and that allows people to be paid also for their content. There are around 5,500 European publications that are entering into those agreements with us. So these things all act in concert, I would say. The question of controls, the question of the value exchange, and I think what you're starting to see here is the emergence of principles that give guidance to a search engine like Google as to the fair way of dealing. And my expectation is that these will kind of form baseline principles for everyone who's creating generative text, right? You provide a set of principles as to how you ought to be operating in the market, what you should do with attribution, what you should do when it comes to value exchange. So that's sort of our thinking on these processes. Quite right and proper that regulators should be asking us about this, and we're very happy to engage in those discussions.
Okay, so you commented specifically on CMA, so I wondered whether you had any comments on the European Commission's approach to exploitative abuses.
I think the way in which you frame these from a legal perspective comes to the same outcome. Essentially, what you're driving at with the notion of exploitation is I can be exploited in multiple different ways, of course, right? Yeah. I have no control over my content. You don't send me traffic for my content. You don't pay me for my content. So I see the family of concerns potentially also, I mean, how you frame it from a legal perspective. Of course, the Competition and Markets Authority wasn't thinking about this in terms of 102 and exploitation. It was applying the Digital Act in the UK. But I think it's just a question of there's the legal framing and the actual import of it. And I think we tend to be focusing on the same kinds of issues. And as I say, I think we're making good progress in those areas.
Okay. And going not only into Article 102, but into the European Commission's competition policy enforcement more broadly. So here comes the DMA, and it's becoming a key point of attraction for capturing conduct that is taking place on the AI front as well. So now it seems that the regulator is trying to capture some AI embedded features through the DMA, whilst in the review that it issued in May, it has left open whether it's going to adapt or issue a report to try to add a new CPS to the list under Article 2. So I wanted to ask you, how do you perceive this dichotomy is going to evolve over time, whether it makes sense to you, and building on your experience, what evidence do you think that supports the European Commission's enforcement strategies in picking one of those legal venues, and what would be the best approach?
So I think that the first question perhaps is, why is the European Commission looking at artificial intelligence in the round at all? Why are the competition rules being used for that? And I think the answer to that is very obvious to all of us. There's a huge amount of potential for AI to trigger fantastic productivity growth in the European Union. Opinions vary, but I think there's a broad consensus that there will be productivity gains through the deployment of artificial intelligence. Some estimates, I think, put the potential gain in the region of 1.2 trillion euros over the next decade. Opinions vary, but the potential, we think, is there. So if that is the case, it's quite right that competition regulators should be thinking about, in this great opportunity, how do we ensure that the playing field is fair, right? That people can enter and expand on the merits. Seems like a very sensible policy decision from my perspective. At the same time, we are all seeing massive growth and uptake in AI tools. It's remarkable to me that ChatGPT was able to zoom straight to 100 million users in 2 months compared to Instagram, which took about 2 years to get to the same numbers. And they're now running at about 1 billion monthly active users. So you have that tremendous potential, we would say, and also at the same time, you have remarkable growth, a very fast moving space. It's very sensible that regulators should be thinking about that. Why the Digital Markets Act? Well, the Digital Markets Act can accommodate AI, right? There are parts of the definitions in the Digital Markets Act that we first received, us enthusiasts, a couple of years ago. You could already see things like definition of a virtual assistant written in there. You could already see that a search engine was defined as something that could return results in any format, right? I think it was already anticipating that things like summaries and overviews would be like an emergent technology that you see within search engines. So the tools are there. It's reasonable to be focusing on those from a policy perspective, given what's at stake. And the questions seem to be focusing on the kinds of things that are designed to accelerate growth and expansion. We're looking at things like interoperability, data portability. We're asking ourselves designation questions about virtual assistants, whether they should be brought in scope or not. So all of the tools are there. The DMA is versatile, and I think it's natural when you're making decisions now as to what you would prioritize and look at, that you would think about deploying the Digital Markets Act. As to the decisions in a particular case, why would you go for 102 over the Digital Markets Act? That's less obvious to me. It doesn't surprise me at all that you would want to use both sets of tools. The Commission's always been very clear that these are complements. The DMA doesn't replace the treaty, to act in concert. So I think it's at their discretion as to how they deploy those tools. I will say this: when you ask about the right approach when it comes to thinking about how you ought to intervene, what changes you ought to be asking the companies to make, I perhaps have one simple observation on that, which is that it's quite important, just like when you're thinking about where search engines ought to be, what's our vision for what a search engine should be? Should it be a list of blue links, or can it be more? I've told you what my view is on that. So too, when it comes to DMA interventions and a 102 case, you need to have a clear sense of where we're trying to get to. And being very open and transparent with consumers, with the community that's sort of observing these cases as to both sides of the ledger seems very important to me. So when we say that the objective of this particular potential intervention is to make sure that there are more agents on your phone, right? That you have more access to different types of virtual assistant on your phone. Or we want all of your wearable devices to be able to interoperate with your device. Those seem like laudable goals. I think that's a sensible place to be heading, and you can understand the attraction to consumers. But at the same time, I think it's very important to be open and transparent about some of the costs that may come with that, right? We're going to do this thing. We think this is the right intervention, but there is a risk that your device breaks. Yeah, there is a risk that your camera roll or your emails might suddenly be ported to another application. So going into these discussions being with a very clear view of what we're trying to achieve, what some of the costs may be, why we decide not to do some things and to do others is to me what's most important here. And I think if we're going to be honest and transparent with everyone who's observing whether or not the DMA is a success, and I think we're still all waiting to make those determinations, it will be very important to be clear about both sides of the ledger.
Building on that, you also, I think, mentioned this idea of more agents being available on your phone, wearable devices on OSs, and these are 6-7 cases which give some leeway to privacy and security justifications that the gatekeepers might put forward before the European Commission, so as to not be compelled so much or to the extent that the European Commission would want to with regards to some detailed measures. And in that sense, also the recent preliminary measures issued by the European Commission and Article 611 have also made privacy experts call wolf in terms of their all-encompassing nature, given that, for instance, that on the side of 6.7, more attack surfaces will make Google's OS more vulnerable, or on the side of 6.11, that the European Commission's anonymization techniques are not backed by formal privacy models. So aside from this clash between privacy and the DMA that we have already seen and we already know of, and other gatekeepers have raised as a potential caveat to try to avoid complying with the law, how do we reconcile this? How do we move forward from here onwards, and what we can do better in order to understand and to assess this interplay and ensure that it reaches an adequate balance?
It's a very good question. It's a very timely question, of course. You're quite right that there have been privacy experts raising concerns around various aspects of the Digital Markets Act. Privacy experts who are raising questions about the potential implications of 611 when it comes to releasing search data, for sure. You're also quite right that various gatekeepers have raised privacy as a concern. I will say this just as a opening gambit. I'm not sure that all gatekeepers take the same perspective on this, right? It's not necessarily the case of, privacy is a concern, therefore I will not do anything. There's one approach, but then there's also privacy is a concern here, and there are alternative ways of protecting that. And here's my recommendation. I think it's important to kind of distinguish between different gatekeepers at different moments, making different types of arguments. It is very true, and you know this better than I do, that across multiple provisions, the DMA affects consumers and private information, right? Whether we're talking about data portability, we're talking about interoperability, we're talking about exporting search data, a variety of different places where this comes up. And consumers quite naturally will have that in mind when they're thinking about the success or not of the Digital Markets Act. Yes, I want the new applications. Yes, I want to see entry and expansion. All of that, as I say, laudable goals of the European Commission's DMA enforcement. However, I don't want that to be something that compromises my privacy. That's quite reasonable to hold those two thoughts in your head as a consumer. And the DMA obviously anticipates this. And the DMA writes into the legal text those considerations. So when you come to Article 611, it specifies a data set in quite specific terms, and it also specifies anonymization using the word. So the DMA imports those ideas. Why is anonymization important in 611? Well, because without it, a lot of things can go wrong, right? The nature of the questions that you ask a search engine can reveal information. Insofar as that information is being shared with people who you weren't anticipating for purposes you don't understand, then that's a problem. And so anonymization is written there in black and white to ensure that those kinds of things don't happen. But it's a challenging balancing exercise, right, for the company and for the European Commission. How do we ensure that we get the utility of the data set? Also, very clear from the Digital Markets Act what 611 ought to achieve from a utility perspective, but at the same time, ensuring that we hit that legally required anonymization goal. So my own thoughts on how to strike the balance. Well, look, I think these are not processes that you can rush. And these are not processes that can be subjective. If ever there was a place where we need to be led by the data and the evidence and to be transparent about the risks that we're seeing and how we're trying to address them, this is a place for that. I think anonymization specifically invites a good, honest conversation around the facts and the evidence. I will say this, the specification processes are challenging because they are extremely fast. You have 6 months, and that therefore means that your room to have those kinds of conversations, to invite commentary from industry, to have privacy experts debating the merits of particular modes of compliance is very limited. And I think that is a challenge that is in the legislation. We have to manage with it. But thinking carefully about what you do within the specification and then what you can continue to talk through in implementation is something that perhaps one can reflect on. Because the risk, and I'll stop here, the risk of specifications driving towards a deadline and aiming to be fully complete at that moment is that you blast straight through a very obvious red light. And if that's the case, not only does it mean that 611 has a sort of backfiring effect for consumers, we've achieved utility for the rivals, but I'm sorry, it came with this cost to you and your data. But it also reflects badly on the DMA as a whole, because we have one of the most well-known provisions, one of the most discussed provisions, leading to an outcome that no one is happy with. And I think that then reflects badly on the Digital Markets Act and the project as a whole. So it's a place where prudence and care in the processes that we deploy to strike the balance is going to be particularly important.
I would maybe challenge the fact that the DMA delivering on results where no one is happy is basically what the DMA maybe is about, because I think that we cannot reach conclusions and solutions which are good for everyone. So there is some, as you were saying, there is some costs involved, and we are seeing that enforcement.
I think that's very fair. If I may just react to that, I think that's very fair, and I think you see that in a variety of different provisions. Article 6.5 is a good example. You have
I was thinking about that.
Number of different stakeholders, and it's impossible to keep. I mean, in life, it's impossible for everyone to be happy all of the time. And the older and wiser you become, the more you realise that it's not about trying to ensure that everyone maintains the status quo, right? That's not about technology, innovation, product launches and change do not mean that we maintain the status quo. It goes back to our earlier conversation about the launch of AI summaries. But at the same time, I think you can go into these conversations and be very honest and transparent with everyone as to the costs that are involved, why we have intentionally assumed them. And that's really where I think my head is that it's not, we are intentionally assuming costs. Stakeholders are aware. The trade-off is made in a transparent and evidence-led way. Then I think you're quite right. We won't maintain universal happiness. We will not, we won't get to that point, but at least we'll have a sense of why we did what we did.
Yeah. So with that thought, I think that we can finish there. So thank you so much, Oli, for joining us here in the Agora. Also for the audience, do not forget to subscribe, like, rate the video. Also drop any comments you'd like for me to answer. Maybe if they are too good a comment, I will pass it on to Oli and he can answer those. So thank you so much, Oli, for your time and for being also so transparent with how you are approaching all of this nitty-gritty and details going on with the DMA's enforcement and also these dialogues with the European Commission. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.